Now, the late former cabinet minister and ANC veteran Zola Skweyiya was honored at a memorial service today, and here to pay tribute to his former colleague, former comrade, and someone he knew for many, many decades is Dr. Penuell Maduna. Good evening. Thank you very much for talking to us. Well, the first time you met Zola Skweyiya?
I arrived in exile in 1980 after a short stint, in fact 2 stints of detention under the Terrorism Act. I first stayed with Judge Albie Sachs in Maputo. After that, of course, I moved all over. And I met the late Dr. Zola Skweyiya at a meeting sponsored by the Organization of African Unity in 1984 in a town in Tanzania called Arusha. We took to liking each other. I am 10 years exactly younger than he was. Struck me as one of those people who, in a very quiet way, would make it his duty to understand where the individual he was interacting with came from. So I came from the dusty townships myself, and we had a long chat. But the chat centered, interestingly enough, on the condition of the people on the ground. You must remember, he had been out of the country for more than 2 decades. So news about home, even if it were stale news by the time I met him, was still great news, because you were able to talk to him about home. And he had come from Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa, where he was the ANC's chief representative. That meeting was crucial for us as the ANC in many respects. And it was an honor for me to be instructed to join him in participating in that. Our main role together with him was to give a briefing about what was truly and really happening on the ground post-1976, the Soweto uprisings. And I can tell you the reception we got was great. After that, of course, we interacted. I remember one time I was instructed by the late Johnny Makatini and the former president Thabo Mbeki to, together with A.B. Chikane, take an Afrikaner professor from Cape Town. His initials were H.W., and his surname was Van der Merwe, but he insisted on being called Javier, a Quaker, who was actually to address a small gathering of OAU leaders on what was happening within the apartheid regime, the various levels of thinking about the future. Because, as everybody would rightly say, after June 1976, things could no longer return to where they once were. So it was in that context that I met Zola, interacted with him. And we did quite a number of meetings with him, even before the formation of the ANC's Legal and Constitutional Affairs Department.
Which is where I want to go, because I want to talk specifically about the work that you, him, and Albie Sachs that you mentioned actually did. Now, I want us to fast forward to, to go back to 1985.
Yes.
You had arrived the year before.
Yes.
In 1985, Tambo had given a directive that on the back of the Kabwe conference, the ANC has to start preparing right, for a post-apartheid South Africa. Now, you then discover that the Freedom Charter raw as it is, doesn't really give, as much as it was this unifying document that gave the movement, a sense of direction and what needs to be done, but it didn't have the kind of detail that was needed to give the clearest signal as to how the ANC sees a post-apartheid South Africa.
Yes.
Now this then becomes the job of this committee that is led by Zola Skweyiya. You and Albie Sachs and the late Professor Asmal are part of this committee.
Yes.
Take us through the work that you had to do under his leadership.
For a short while, the committee was led by Professor Jack Simons, who had been an outstanding scholar,
Academic,
etc. It was initially led by him, but of course, he was quite advanced in terms of age, and so Zola took over.
apparently a bit of a maverick as well.
A very interesting old man, right, may I say. So Zola took over, and in his very quiet way, because Zola was always quiet, he had to pull together all these ANC resources. The instruction that had come from Oliver Tambo and the National Executive Committee was that we needed to put together a team whose main focus would be what was happening on the ground as well as in the world or international context. You must remember that 1985 is critical in many respects. This is the year of glasnost and perestroika, the takeover of the Soviet Union by Gorbachev. So this is a very, very important period.
I prefer to call it more openness, right?
Yes, that's it, yeah, openness, etc. And fundamental change in the Soviet system. So now the instruction is whatever else you may be doing or thinking of doing, you need to focus on all these developments inside the country as well as outside the country, and vibrantly interact with a whole lot of opinion makers, scholars, trade unions, etc. With the view to sketching for ourselves, for our people, for our followers, for our country and the world, the sort of South Africa that we would see post-apartheid from the point of view of the African National Congress. And this was a very interesting task. The instruction was go beyond the Freedom Charter and begin to sketch this so that people could see the ANC emerging as it were. The leader in this development, in this exercise, because everybody, including the apartheid regime, had accepted that change was a must, and some people were beginning to talk to the ANC about a possible round table for negotiation. So the ANC would not want to be taken by surprise.
And that's how then your committee came with what we know today as the Bill of Rights.
Well, let's walk a bit back. The committee came out with what was called the constitutional guidelines. A very interesting thing, because we could not call that document a negotiation position or perspective when no negotiation was
taking place,
visibly looming on the horizon. So it was clear to us that we could only say, this is what would guide us in any interaction with anyone. You must remember that by that time, for historic reasons, but essentially because of the successes the African National Congress had made on the ground and internationally, the ANC headquarters in Lusaka had become the mecca of South African politics. So everybody wanted to know what the ANC thinking was on all this. So that committee of ours was very, very crucial and very critical.